Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Minnesota Historical Society's History at Home. Tonight, we're here with Chad Moncrief, the author of In That Very Northern City, Recovering a Forgotten Struggle for Racial Integration in Duluth. I'm the editor of Minnesota History, Laura Weber, and in addition to my editing work, my own writing focuses on the history of Minnesota's Jewish community and architectural history and heritage preservation. Minnesota History is the quarterly journal of the Minnesota Historical Society and is a benefit of membership. It's also available online for purchase, and all the PDFs from our entire 115-year history are also available on our website. All right, welcome, Chad. I'll give you a brief introduction. Chad Moncrief is professor in the history department at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He's the author of 4 books, including The Myth of Silent Spring, Rethinking the Origins of American Environmentalism, published by the University of California Press. And he is currently working on another book, which we will talk about, Whiteness in Plain View, A History of Racial Exclusion in Minnesota. Most recently, he published an article called A Bigoted, Prejudiced, Hateful Little Area, The Making of an All-White Suburb in the Deep North. And that suburb is Edina, Minnesota. And he published that in the March 2019 issue of the Journal of American History. So I'll give a very brief overview of the article, and then Chad and I will converse. So the article is about Duluth's racial order being left largely intact for decades following the lynchings of 1920. The 1960s brought a measure of progress thanks to the collaboration of an outspoken couple from Chicago, Matthew and Helen Carter. Also, the new leader of the local NAACP chapter, William Maupins, and finally, Thomas L. Smith, a white Unitarian Universalist minister. Together, they challenged Duluth's prevailing residential segregation, ultimately allowing the Carter family to overcome neighborhood opposition and build a new home in an all-white neighborhood along the Lake Superior waterfront. So Chad, you are not a native Minnesotan. You have no Minnesota connections. You teach on the East Coast. How did you come to write about Minnesota?
It's a good question. Well, as you mentioned, the last book I published was about the history of environmentalism, and it's pretty much what I've been doing since I started with graduate school. I was looking at labor and environmental history, and I kind of felt like I'd reached the end of the arc of that work, and I wanted to go off in a different direction. And I was particularly interested because of also things that I had been studying in environmental history, to look at race in American history. But I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I grew up in a subdivision called Plainview, and I was thinking for a while about the whiteness of Plainview, and I looked into the history of Louisville as a story about racial exclusion, and there's definitely a story there. But then more that I got into it, I wanted to think about, well, how does that work in the North? Because I wanted to do something that added to the conversation the idea that the racial exclusion and segregation aren't just a Southern phenomenon, but that they're also happening in the American North. And Malcolm X has this famous quote that everything, south of the Canadian border is the South, right? And there's a way in which, of course, there are differences between the North and the South, and we can get into that, but that people like Malcolm X and others recognize that racism is something that it permeates the history of America, whatever region we're talking about. And so I actually talked to Jim Loewen about the idea, and Jim Loewen published the Sundown Towns book. And originally what I wanted to do is make a documentary film about it, because I had published several books, and I just thought, well, I wanted to reach a more general audience. So I went up to Edina because Jim had suggested that would be a good place to start to tell a story about racial exclusion. And I did some some shooting up there, and then also went to Austin, Minnesota, did some shooting down there. And we put together a sample roll. And as I did the research, though, I realized that the story, maybe it's just because I'm an historian, but I just realized that the story was just going beyond the limitations of documentary, that I couldn't really be faithful to tell the complexity of the story if I held to like a 60-minute documentary film. So then I decided again to write a book about it. But interestingly, of course, since I grew up in Louisville, and you and I will talk about this a little bit later, I think, but you know, I started writing the introduction to the book, and I had thought I'd talk about Louisville and explain this very thing about how I ended up talking about Minnesota, talking about racial exclusion in my home city, and then what's going on in the north. And then I thought, well, that's a distraction. I'm just going to focus it on Minnesota, and I took all the Louisville, Kentucky stuff out, and then, of course, what happened, you know, in the spring and the summer, Breonna Taylor, police killing Breonna Taylor, police killing George Floyd, and the connection now is something that I probably I'll have to go back and revise the introduction, because I see a connection between the two, and I have to work with that.
So you begin the article talking about the Duluth lynching. So would you like to maybe give a brief summary of the narrative of the article?
Okay, well, so the article actually, it does mention the story very briefly, tells the sort of the narrative of the lynching, but it kind of then very quickly goes forward in time and talks about how a color line is established in Duluth in basically the post-World War II era. But the chapter that I'm writing, where that story is included, looks again at the lynching, and I actually found a lot of different primary sources that allow me to get a little bit more complicated with that as well. And I mean, it's something I'm not really going to talk about tonight, but what I then realized is that there's a background to the lynching, that there's decades of racism in Duluth that precede the lynching. The lynching just doesn't just happen, right? And then the lynching is followed by more decades of racism in Duluth. And so I try to contextualize the lynching in the chapter, and I do that a little bit in the article, but not so much as trying to focus on the story of the housing integration campaign that the Carters are involved in.
So how about a little background about the history of the African-American community in Duluth in the 20th century up until the time of the Carter family housing story?
So, initially, African-Americans were attracted to Duluth. Well, there's actually a small group of African-Americans who are coming to Duluth in the post-Civil War era, and they're going to other parts of Minnesota too. This is actually the early version of the early start of the Great Migration, where the Great Migration, as I found out and as other scholars have also talked about, doesn't just happen during and after World War I, but in fact is going on from the 1870s on. And so there are people coming to Minnesota from the South, African-Americans coming from the South. But the big wave that begins happens in the early 20th century, when the steel company goes down and recruits people to come and work at Minnesota Steel. And so you get about 100 African Americans coming to Duluth, living mostly in the southern part of the city, and working the steel mill, and working in jobs that are set up for them and sort of considered to be black jobs. They're paid lower wages. They're the most dangerous. They're the most difficult to do. And they're not allowed to live in the company housing that the Minnesota Steel builds in Morgan Park. Instead, they have to live in Gary, which is described by one black steel worker as a shanty town at the time. So from the beginning, African Americans are experiencing job discrimination, and they're experiencing housing discrimination. There are other African Americans that follow, and then they go and live in other parts of Duluth and the East Hillside and Central Hillside areas and downtown. But they're also limited to menial occupations, menial jobs.
And weren't they brought in unbeknownst to them as, I don't know if it was strikebreakers or just to undercut wages of the white workers, or how did that work?
Yeah, there's some white workers who are trying to start a union in the 1920s. There, as other places, steel workers were getting sort of their consciousness was getting raised in terms of their class, and so the company was responding, trying to divide the workers by race, by recruiting black workers, thinking that they would work for lower wages, that they wouldn't organize. I tell very briefly, I allude to this in the article, and I have a whole chapter about it. But in Austin, in fact, there's a railroad workers strike in the early 1920s, and the company in Austin brings in black strikebreakers for the same purpose, to try to undermine the strike. And it works. The white workers are provoked, and they run the black strikebreakers out of town violently, and then that leads to other African American residents in Austin leaving as well. But so yeah, from the beginning, African Americans are there, and there's a very intentional. The company is very intentionally trying to stoke racial division and racial hatred, and it works fairly to a great extent.
So, what other occupations did African Americans in Duluth do in the early to mid 20th century?
Well, a lot of the men work on the railroad, but they're working as cooks, or they're working as porters. Women work for wealthy white households. They also do laundry. There are men that run elevators, or they are also porters at like saloons, or they're waiters at restaurants. For the most part, they're not in any kind of professional positions. There are a couple lawyers. There is one police officer, very briefly. I think, in fact, I saw conflicting evidence about this, but that might have been an African American woman rather than a man. And I'm not sure why that she was employed by the police department. The most fortunate probably of the black workers in Duluth working at the post office. There were about 20 of them at the greatest number, and that's a federal job. And so for a while, that is a fairly reliable position for black workers in terms of stability and in terms of wages. And you'll see that in other parts of Minnesota. The workers who are at the post office often are the middle class, black middle class, or they're part of the black middle class.
And wasn't the one of the most fancy restaurant in Duluth? It was called the Flame.
Right. So there are 60 African Americans at one point that work there. They're all working as waiters. They're working as busboys, cooks. But they are not, as is true of a lot of other restaurants in Duluth, they're not allowed to go there to eat, only to work. And the same is true for Duluth movie theaters. African Americans have to sit usually in the balcony. I was kind of actually, I have to say, after even doing research for several years about Minnesota, I was surprised at how much like it was the South in terms of the racial segregation that was taking place in public spaces, which is interesting too, because in 1885, Minnesota did pass a law prohibiting segregation in public spaces. And the test case for that happened 10 years later in 1897 in Duluth. And it had to do with an African American who had actually once been enslaved going into a saloon with a white friend of his and being refused service. And then that provoked a whole chain of events that led to changing the law that included saloons, which had been left out of the law prohibiting segregation there. But even with the law, after the turn of the century, still there's segregation in Duluth as well as in other cities around Minnesota in terms of restaurants, movie theaters, and as we'll talk about in terms of housing.
So after the lynchings in Duluth, the NAACP Duluth began an NAACP chapter, and that's how the story of one of our main actors, Bill Maupins, comes in. So could you give us a little overview of the NAACP in Duluth until the 50s?
He is immediately established after the lynching in the summer of 1920, but it's even it's something I'll talk about more I talk about more in the book, but the person that the people that come together decide to make the president of the first chapter of the chapter of the NAACP was actually owner of a saloon, or what they call a blind pig, because at the time it's prohibition, and he's also running gambling in there. And this is in Gary. It's called the Gary Canteen. And so there's a lot of questions about the way in which even it's sort of rooted in a tension within the Black community that has to do with class. And they actually just basically destroy another Black group called the Civic Club that had been functioning. For a while, then for the next few decades, it doesn't really do a lot. It doesn't, well, I mean, it just can't. There's just, the white racism is so entrenched that there's not a lot that the NAACP can do. And by the end of the 1950s, the person who was in charge was Lee Wiley, who was actually a labor activist. He had been played a really instrumental role in establishing a steelworkers union along with white workers. So there's a way in which that hadn't started to sort of like change somewhat. But he hadn't been also to do much with the NAACP chapter. And then Bill Maupins decided he wanted to try to, move it in a different direction. And he became president probably in 1958. It's a little uncertain exactly when that happened, but probably 1958. And then he launched two sort of different efforts, one in terms of job discrimination and another in terms of housing discrimination in Duluth. And so that's Bill Maupins there on your left. And then we have Musa Foster and Setu Jones, who are involved in a Black oral history project overseen by David Vassar Taylor in Minnesota, which is an incredible resource for telling this story, as well as other parts of Black history in the state.
I just would love to interview General College for 5 years. And he's a wonderful historian, and I still rely on him for peer review for the magazine. So, Maupins, Mr. Maupins, could you just give us a little background of him and his working at UMD and the job discrimination he experienced before he got to work at UMD, University of Minnesota at Duluth?
Mm-hmm. So he actually got a degree in political science at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and tried to get a job in the offices at Minnesota Steel, and they told him no Black people are working in the offices. Right? There were no African Americans allowed to get any of those office jobs. That he could get a job in the yard, but that was it. And so then he refused to do that, and he eventually got a job as a lab superintendent at UMD. And then he also he actually became a widower, and he is raising his kids on his own. And he then became in charge of NAACP, and that's the end of the 1950s, which also coincides with the arrival of Matt and Helen Carter to Duluth as well.
Yes. So let's talk about the couple, Matt and Helen Carter, who are at the center of the story. A little background of, they come from the South originally.
Yeah, so I think they're very important individually. I'm very interested in their lives, and I for sure could not have told the story without interviewing Matt Carter, who was born in 1926. So when I interviewed him in 2016 or 17, he's in his 90s. And I remember that interview went on for 2.5 hours. At one point I said, halfway through, do you want to take a break? And he said, no. And I was thinking, well, I kind of want to take a break, but he just wanted to go on. So we did. And it was an incredible afternoon, hearing him tell his whole life story. And the thing is, like, also as a just a person American in the narrative, he represents a lot of things happening in our 20th century. So he and Helen both were born in Mississippi. Matt grew up with his mother doing sharecropping, and Helen actually is a little bit more privileged. Her dad worked on the railroad, and her mom was able to just not work outside the household. She eventually went on to college and became a teacher. Matt eventually goes to Chicago and starts working on lake boats. And this is Helen on the left and Matt on the right, obviously. And then eventually Matt goes back with his cousin to Mississippi one time when his cousin's getting married, and he's in the bridal party, and he and Helen are paired up, and then they decide to get married, and which they do in 1953. And then they move to Chicago, right? So it's a story of Black migration to the urban North. And then from Chicago, they eventually move also to Duluth. So there's a way in which I think they're also representative of what's going on for a lot of other people in Minnesota as well.
So Matt and Helen have a growing family, and the apartments they're living in that Central Hillside district are just not sufficient, and Matt tries to buy a house and he's not successful. So then what happens?
So yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of good new conversation happening about how the government, both the local, state, and federal governments, impede African Americans getting fair housing, both renting apartments or buying homes, and those are important. That's an important conversation. It's been going on for a while, actually. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, is getting a lot of attention, but historians have been talking about this for a long time. But I also feel like Matt's story is interesting because, like a number of other cases that I study in Minnesota, it isn't just the government that's doing this. He goes and tries to find a place to rent or find a place that he can buy a house. And there are all kinds of ways that whites orchestrate keeping him out of there, and it doesn't always have to do with anything official, right? So the lynching is where I start, in fact, because there's like an established event of violence, right? That tells African Americans that there's a certain place for them in society, and if they try to challenge that they will be that they could face a lot of like terrible consequences. And there's all kinds of intimidation. There's realtor deceit. Matt tries to use a realtor. The realtor steers him in the wrong direction. He goes to people's homes and tries to rent a place that's for rent, and they tell him no, they don't rent to Black people, and they don't have the right to do this, but they do it anyway. And so eventually, what he ends up doing is buying property on London Road, which is near where Helen teaches, and closer to Two Harbors, where he has to ship out on his boat. But he has to do this with a straw purchaser who's white, which is the Thomas Smith, who's a reverend at the Unitarian Church. So Smith gets Ed Herbert, who owns the property, Herbert, to sell him the property, not knowing that Thomas is going to give it to Matt. Although Matt had tried to buy it from Ed before, and Ed had refused him. So then Matt was going around him and getting Thomas to buy it. And Thomas was doing it because he was very interested in challenging housing discrimination. So he was open to the idea.
So I should also mention that people can start putting questions in the comments box, and we'll get to those in about 8 minutes. So do you want to talk about the NAACP challenging a new fair housing law and the Fair Housing Ordinance campaign briefly? And yeah.
So Minnesota has a law in 1953 that outlaws discrimination, housing discrimination in public accommodations. It also prohibits racial restrictive covenants, although the United States Supreme Court had already basically said those were not enforceable in the 1948 ruling, Shelley versus Kramer. They are trying. Then there's an effort by the St. Paul Housing Redevelopment Authority to remove hundreds, if almost like probably maybe 1,000 or more people from the state capital area, and then Rondo, and then the Selby Dale area. And that forces African Americans to try to go find housing. Whites as well who are living there. Whites don't really have as much of a problem, but it becomes clear that Blacks can't just be displaced and then move somewhere else, because they end up facing discrimination. And so that gives them more motivation to try to get a fair housing law passed, which they finally do in the early part of 1962, which would go into effect at the end of 1962. Meanwhile, Matt and Helen bought the property, and they're trying to get the permits to build for it. And white neighbors hear about this. They didn't know that African Americans was going to move into their community. Once they did, they rallied to stop it, but they don't lead by saying they don't want African Americans to live with them. They come up with different reasons for opposing it, right? Which is also true of other cases I study in Minnesota. They'll talk about drainage, or they'll talk about traffic, or they'll talk about property values, but they don't say we don't want a Black family to live next to us. We just don't want traffic to be worse, right? But they don't do that when white people are trying to also buy houses or property in their areas. Eventually, Matt prevails. He builds a house. People steal all the plywood that he he had to build a house, so that slows it down. Eventually, though, the house is built, and then shortly after that, a few years later, some people repeatedly vandalize the house and spray paint racist graffiti on it. And that's another interesting moment in Duluth history where you see the sheriff as well as the newspaper and other people responding saying they don't understand what's going on. Like, Duluth isn't a racist town. Why would people do this? It must just be some, some deranged individual or two people who are doing this. And to me, that's another sort of way of looking at this, that white people are really good at forgetting and actually just not even seeing, in fact, what's very much in front of them in the present time, the racist social order that they have been enabling and protecting and preserving, and they keep going into the future.
So Ed Hebert and his wife, would you talk about how that relationship ended up developing with Matt and Helen?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a testament to Matt and Helen as a couple, but also to Ed and his wife, Adeline. Eventually, they become friends and they start socializing on holidays. And Adeline gets Alzheimer's disease. Matt and Helen help get her into a assisted living in Superior. Herbert also has to go into assisted living. They help him with that. Ed just tells Matt, I'm going to sell you my house for less than it's worth, just to basically give you the property. But Matt refuses, saying, you need to use that for your own health care. And there are other people. The neighbors actually put together a block watch so that, to keep vandals from coming back and doing graffiti. So there are ways in which white people change, perhaps, their initial position. But I mean, if you look at the statistics, in the 1960s, Matt and Helen are very much an anomaly. Most African Americans are still segregated in the same place that they were living before. Even as the population began to increase again with the Air Force Base's expansion, you get a doubling of the population from 1950 to 1960, or 1960 to 1970. And yet most of the Air Force, the people that are coming in for the Air Force Base, they can't find housing outside of certain areas. White people are still refusing to rent them apartments, and the income poverty level is still basically where African Americans are at in terms of their incomes, and that doesn't change much even into the turn of the century until into 2000. So there's not a lot of progress made. As much as I want to tell the story as like, Matt, Helen, and Thomas Smith and Bill Maupins doing something to try to end or erode segregation, job and housing segregation, and job discrimination, and housing segregation in Duluth. It's not really a story of progress, that to a great extent.
So I'll ask one more, and then we'll open it up to the questions that have started to come in, and you can keep audience members writing in. So this whole issue is done by email, and as the article was already in the beginning of layout stage is when George Floyd was murdered. And so I read Chad's original conclusion again, and I saw an article in the Tribune that talked about how the statistics in Duluth about housing ownership, and I said, are you willing to rewrite the end? And we were able to do that. So Chad, do you want to talk about that a little bit as our last comment or questions?
I'm kind of always conflicted about it, but when you publish an article, you kind of want to like leave like you want to give people a reason to think about like how this might launch you into doing something about making change. But then, I mean, literally, as you say, like as you and I were going back and forth on this, you live very close to the 3rd Police Precinct. Like helicopters are flying over your house. There's tear gas everywhere, and like, in good conscience, I just thought this is absurd. Like I actually emailed you. I was worried about you, thinking, what's going on?
Close to the 38th and sorry, Chicago.
Like, what is going on with you? And that really did shape the way. I mean, I think if I could do it, I could write a much longer conclusion. Now we had to get it together to get it published, but. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting context to be writing this, and for me to be writing this book. I mean, the book that I'm writing, this is part of a book a larger study of racial exclusion in Minnesota, and hopefully I'll get it done by the end of the summer, because I think it can add to the conversation that people need to be having about why Minnesota is in the place that it's in the present, and also generally in the United States, why what is happening in the United States is happening. I think historians can contribute to helping people understand that. And it just so happened that I decided on this particular topic when, years ago, and did the research. Fortunately, I got the research done before COVID, also because I couldn't go back and continue to do that. So now that everything's shut down, so. I think Laura's muted, actually.
Okay, so someone wants to know, how are these, early color lines still present in Duluth today? We've talked about that a little bit.
Well, another interesting, there was, I can't remember his name. His first name was Adam, but there was a guy from Brooklyn who came to Duluth, and he wrote a story very recently, maybe in the spring, about, asking, so why is Duluth white? And he was like perplexed. Like, that was the end of the story, was, I don't know. And it's like, I saw this and I thought, this is a way in which I feel like people just do kind of ignore historians. Like, maybe he could have wondered about what happened in the past. Duluth is still a place where, the Black population has increased. So the way in which the lynching and the Great Depression sort of, created forces to push African Americans out, and most of them went to the Twin Cities, that began to lessen so much, and so the population was increasing. But as I said, like, housing segregation is still there, job discrimination is still there. If you look at income, it's still a problem. A great majority of whites in Duluth own houses. It's a very, very small percentage of African Americans. And that's a very important statistic. It's not just about, does somebody own a house or not own a house. If you think about it, like, that is a major form of equity, and white families can live on the equity over generations. They can use that then to increase their wealth over time, send kids to college, and do all kinds of other things, and be more secure when economic problems happen. Blacks are very much more insecure because they don't have that accumulation of wealth over the course of time. And that's also one of the reasons why I wanted specifically to focus on housing in terms of the story of Minnesota and race. Because I think that actually is at the center of a lot of other things. If you want to look at health disparities, education disparities, all kinds of other, the way that we see it show up in terms of incarceration rates, we can go back to racial exclusion in terms of housing, and we can see a lot of where that comes from. I think she's muted again.
Sorry. Did Joe Gomer, a Tuskegee airman who was a friend of the Carters, work directly with, sorry, it went away, but with Matt? Joe Gomer, does that name ring a bell?
Only a little, because I just today, actually, I was reading about that because there's another historian who did a oral history with Matt that I didn't know about, and I'm just was catching up on that. But so I don't really know more about it.
Okay. Were sundown towns or sundown rules in town laws, or were they mostly just understood?
Well, and this is a difficult question because Jim Loan actually really helped me get into this topic and introduced me to the people that I needed to talk to in Atlanta when I was the beginning of the story. But I'm not really sure that I think of sundown towns as a very good concept to describe what's happening in the United States in terms of racial exclusion. Certainly, there are many, many, many more places where racial exclusion doesn't happen because the sheriff tells people to get out of town before sundown, or because there's a sign, or because there's a siren on the water tower. In fact, we don't really have a lot of evidence that that happened. I mean, it probably happened, but there's no sign. We don't have any signs. Like you would think if that was prevalent, there would be a sign somewhere in somebody's basement or attic or in a museum or somewhere. And the sirens happen, but the sirens, have they begin with other purposes. And what I hesitate to do in terms of questioning that isn't to say that there isn't racial exclusion, because actually I think that very much is the fact, but actually that there are many, many other ways that whites keep African Americans out of their towns, or that they keep them contained in certain places, right? And like in Austin, for instance, which Jim Loewen describes as a sundown town, saying that there are signs on the road or sheriffs take people out of town, is actually in the Negro Motorist Green Book, right? Which says these are safe places you can go. There's a Fox Hotel in Austin, and if it's a sundown town, I don't know why it's in the Green Book, right? But there's also ways in which blacks know that they're not supposed to come to Austin and live there. They're certainly not going to get a job at Hormel Packing Plant where they can get union scale wages. So to me, it's much more complicated. And the sundown town concept actually kind of gets in the way of us seeing the complexity of what's going on in terms of white people's racism.
Okay.
And how it operates.
So someone wants to know why we are hosting a video on race, as they describe it. Okay, sorry. I'm going to quote, "Anyone interested can research this. I thought the Historical Society's job was to record and preserve history, not meddle in or change it." I could start. I'd say, well, this is exactly what Minnesota History, the magazine, does. And I would venture to say not anyone can research this. It takes some real time and effort and skill. And we are recording and preserving history by publishing articles like Chad's, and now we're talking about Chad's article. So now you can say your piece, Chad.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting observation that I think is related to something I've also heard about people who are resisting the efforts to take down Confederate statues and memorials, right? And they're saying, well, you can't get rid of our history, and that's how they refer to it. That to me is actually suggests like a misunderstanding of how history, what history is. A memorial doesn't get, like, taking down a memorial doesn't get rid of history. It actually addresses something that happened in history. Most of those memorials were put up by racist people to try to give credibility and legitimacy to a new era of segregation after the Civil War. Taking them down is just like giving blacks the right to vote. Do you want to give blacks the right to vote because that's the right thing to do? Do you want to take statues down because you want to like end the effort that white people made to try to give legitimacy to segregation, or do you not, right? And you have to decide what side you stand on. Meanwhile, history doesn't change because you take the memorials down. I do use statues and memorials to teach my students how you understand the past. Like, we look at memorials and we think about, well, why is this guy on a horse? But there's plenty of other ways that you can learn about history. I mean, we don't have a lot of statues of Hitler, but we still know that Hitler existed, right? And we still know that Nazis existed. There are plenty of other resources besides the statues and memorials. And me writing this article doesn't change history. In fact, it recovers history that we don't know. And there's a reason why we don't know it. There's a great effort, as I was alluding to at the end there. White people are really good at historical amnesia, at pretending like something didn't happen, and then being baffled by why, for instance, there are no white people in their town. When in fact they and their grandparents, their parents and their grandparents are responsible for it. A lot of the people that are involved in this are still alive. And I for instance, in the chapter, I give a long list of the people that signed a petition to keep the Carters out of the neighborhood. Those people probably, some of them are still alive, or their kids are still alive, right? And we have lists of Ku Klux Klan members too. And we could go back and we can see, well, are those people in your family? And what do you think about that? You know? And we have to recover that. We can't bury it if we want to understand why we're at where we're at in terms of our present time.
Okay. A comment. It is difficult to find good housing as a Black woman in Duluth. This still happens now. I was looking for housing in 2017 and no one would rent to me as soon as they saw me. I had success in finding housing in Boulder Ridge, which was expensive because application was purely online.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing your experience with that.
Thanks for that comment. That's
yes.
I'm sorry that that's still the case, but it's good that we have, you know, people like coming forward with the evidence that this still exists.
Yeah. Another comment that this is an important story in Minnesota history and Duluth history. Researching it carefully and thoroughly shows respect for the people whose actions helped integrate the city of Duluth. So another question. Many of the MNHS interviews of late have brought up the question of the importance of who tells your story. Can you talk about your experience writing about African-American / Black history as a non-African-American?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. This is actually really as close as I get to doing African-American history. And I kind of got into it because I was trying to tell the story of how white people are racist in the past. And then because I did the interview with Matt, Helen passed away before, so I did an interview just with Matt. Then I felt compelled that I needed to get his story out. He's, you know, in his 90s. I wanted him to see his story in print. I wanted him to know that people knew his story, which we didn't really have out as a part of a you know, in sort of the public realm. Otherwise, my book is about white racism. What I'm trying to do is trace the history of how white people actively are racist, and not like the identity of whiteness, or there's a field of whiteness studies, and that's not what I'm doing. So I'm not really sure what I am, like what I am in terms of as an historian, how I would identify, like, you know, labor historian, environmental historian, African-American historian. Mostly what I want to do is sort of follow the actual ways in which white people keep African-Americans out of their communities, remove them from their communities, or keep them out of their communities, or contain them in their communities. And to me, that's a story about white people. And as a white person, I think I'm obligated to try to do that. I think this is probably going to be my last book as an historian, and I feel like this would be the perfect way to sort of end my career as an historian, is to talk about what white people have done to African Americans, and how that is, what impact that's had on African Americans, and what that's done to our country, and why we have to change that.
Okay. Another comment about voting, and that the fact that in Duluth, the Black population is concentrated, and that the locations of roads and access to transportation makes it difficult to get to the polling places.
Well, I mean, I assume that that's true. I don't live in Duluth. I don't know, but I can tell you, I used to live in Lowell. That's where I teach at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and they actually were having some of the same problems. The city council was all white, school board was all white for a long time, and it's because they had ward-based at-large elections, right? And so they had a couple of different wards electing most of the people, the white wards and the more wealthy wards, and keeping the rest of the community from electing people to office. And Lowell is a very diverse community. It has a lot of immigrants from very different parts of the world. And they managed to come together, file a lawsuit, and they won. And so now Lowell has to go to some ward-based election. So there are ways that you can change this. I don't know if Duluth is a at-large election system or whatever, but there are ways that if community organizes that you can fix that. And but again, as I was saying, like, people don't do this accidentally. There's in Lowell, they very purposefully changed the voting process to do that, so people in a couple of wards could decide who gets on city council. And maybe that's true in Duluth. I actually don't know. That would be very interesting to follow up on that and know the political history of Duluth. Did somebody change that on purpose to try to dilute the vote of everybody in various wards who are maybe concentrated or segregated in sections of the city?
Some people think that sharing history contributes to living in the past and keeping communities from moving on. What are your thoughts and reactions to a statement like that?
I think there are some historians who do that, that just study the past for its own sake. We actually usually refer to them as antiquarians, but and not like, I mean, there's probably antiquarians. Like, I don't know, it's like hard to not say that in a way that sounds like we're calling. But I'm not interested in that kind of history. I've always wanted to address historical questions and problems that have some relevance to the present time. And if that's not happening, I'm not really that interested in it. I'm not saying that people that don't do that aren't doing good history, but I've never been interested in that. And so my book isn't about that kind of history.
Okay. Someone says that she grew up near the Carters, and Kai Carter was a very good friend, and she learned a lot from the Carters. So the thanks to you, Chad, for telling their story. Another comment is, did Matt Carter's story surprise you? Why or why not?
It only surprised me in the fact that it held to almost every single like assumption I had about how Black history works in the 20th century. That he grows up in Mississippi, Helen grows up in Mississippi, they move to the north, then they move to Duluth, they experience job discrimination and housing discrimination. The thing that's different, of course, is that he and Helen decide to fight back. And there's a reason why they do that. And there are reasons why other African Americans do that. And so in some ways, maybe that's slightly surprising, but even then, like, I knew there's also like a group of people that eventually resist and take risks and put themselves out front to try to make some change. So, I guess I wasn't that surprised, but that doesn't mean it wasn't important.
Well, we have time for a couple more questions. Anything else?
I would just want to say, like, I want to make a special thanks to Amy Brown, who is the archivist at the University of Minnesota Duluth. And when I was trying to, I was sort of basically done with my research trips to Minnesota, and she very, very graciously digitized for me what I needed from the Unitarian church files and the Bill Maupins collection. And I really couldn't have told the story without those resources either. And same with Matt Carter doing the interview for 2.5 hours. I did this, by putting those things together, but really collectively there were people contributing to me being able to tell the story. So I thank them, and I thank you for being able to, for us being able to work together to put this article out in the issue.
Okay, do we have any more questions or comments in the stream? What can we do going forward to change things?
This is funny. Like, often as an historian, if I do public events, this is a question that I get, and I have to say, like, I know what people are asking, but I'm not really an expert about that. And I mean, I can tell you about the past. I think we leave it to all of us to figure it out together. There's a lot of people engaged in different kinds of struggle right now. It's very hard to find our way, but we have to do something to make some kind of change. Otherwise, this country might cease to exist as a democracy. And it won't be surprising to me as an historian if it fails because of a racial divide. Like, that's kind of what's been, coming for a long time. But maybe we can make that not happen. But I don't know exactly how. We'll not make that happen.
Okay. I know that. Oh, here we go. Have you done this sort of research in other cities? You've mentioned Austin and Edina, Minnesota.
Yeah, so the book actually goes from the early 19th century to the late 20th century. After I talk about the ways in which Native Americans are part of a first racial exclusion, with the Dakota being removed after the Sioux Uprising. And at the same time, African Americans arriving at the end of the Civil War, then I look at that history of African Americans moving into mostly outstate towns. And then I talk about Austin, and I talk about Duluth. then I talk about Edina, and then now, right now I'm working on a chapter on Rondo, and then at the end of the book I'll talk about human rights commission efforts in Bloomington and St. Louis Park.
Okay, thank you.
Those are just examples. Like, as I wanted to say about Edina and Duluth, like, they're not exceptional. It's not like there's, more racist people in these towns, or that this is somehow unusual. In fact, what I'm trying to suggest is this is a story about not only Minnesota, but America. This is happening all over the country. And as to kind of go back full circle to where we started, it's not just about the South. This is happening in the American North as well. And if we really want to take stock of why we're in the present time where we're at, we need to acknowledge that it is a national story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This conversation's been recorded and archived, and it's on YouTube, so you can share it with your friends who weren't able to join tonight. But thank you, Chad Montry, University of Massachusetts at Lowell, for joining us tonight. And I believe you're going to be on the radio tomorrow in Duluth, for those in Duluth, KUMD, I believe, so 9:50 or so a.m.
All right, 9:20.
9:20. We'll put that in the stream of comments too. So thanks again for this fascinating conversation, and thanks everyone for attending Minnesota Historical Society History at Home.